Okay, this is Helen Thomas and the CDFM study group. I want to make sure I notify everyone on this video that this video is being recorded live. So if you make sure, unless you're speaking, keep your microphones muted so we don't hear the background information, because it will be uploaded on the video once we put it on YouTube. I think last week we had a hot mic, so thankfully you didn't, whoever the individual was, they didn't say anything too crazy. So be mindful of that as if you're around other people or so forth when you're speaking, is that whatever is being said will be recorded on the video. All right, so before we actually start with 1.3, which is the enterprise risk management and internal control process, does anyone have any question on anything you've gone over in the first two competency areas? Anything you need me to clarify? Maybe you reviewed the videos and you had some additional questions that I didn't clarify enough and you need me to go over it. Because everything builds off of each other. So this is not an exam where you study one part and you forget about it. You have to bring that material with you. So I will always consistently ask same questions at different points, because you have to be able to tie the information you learn in competency 1.1, 1.2 as we move on to 1.3. So all it's doing is building. So do I have any questions or comments that anyone would like to share with the group at this point? Okay, I don't hear anything, so we'll go ahead and move on. So the last couple of weeks, we kind of went over the basic understanding of the structures of the government and the separation of powers based on the Constitution, what things are governed in the various articles 1, 2, and 3. We talked about last week gifts. Can we accept gifts from contractors? Manpower, we talked about if we had to do a manpower study, the requirements to notify Congress, especially if you're talking about the jobs of 46 or more government employees. So different things we talked about last week. So now what we're going to look at in competency 3 is the enterprise risk management and internal control. So think of risk management as identifying everything that you do, every decision you make, there is an associated risk with that request or that action. So what we're going to be looking at now is, based as a manager, as a supervisor, a director, whatever your title is, if you're in charge of federal operations, there's an associated risk. There are things that you have to do internally to ensure that you mitigate those risks. So those are some of the things. So on page 135, in the first paragraph, you have some definitions there. Because the older study guides, the risk management was a separate entity from internal control. So now they're together. So enterprise risk management, ERM, what is that? It's identifying, assessing, and managing risk. ERM, enterprise risk management. So the word risk is in there, but you need to know what ERM stands for, because again, most likely on the exam, you might just see the acronym ERM and not the whole explanation for it. So you need to know it's dealing with assessing your risk. And then your internal control are those steps, those measures, those actions as a manager that you put in place to provide that reasonable assurance, because and nobody's 100% on any action, is the reasonable assurance that all actions that you have, all processes in your organization are in place to reduce that risk. So you kind of put those two together. In the third paragraph, so remember OMB, what's this OMB stand for and who do they work for? And anyone can answer at this time. What does OMB stand for and who do they work for?
Good morning. That would be the Office of Management and Budget, and they work for the executive branch,
The
or
executive branch or the president. That's correct. Thank you, sir, Mr. Allen. So Office of Management and Budget, you want to know why do we care what they push out? Because they're in charge of the budget. So in the third paragraph on the bottom of page 135, you see you have several circulars. Whenever we get guidance from OMB, it is often published in an OMB circular. So we've already talked about OMB circular A11. Does anyone remember what type of information you can find in OMB circular A11? I think it's like 3 of them we've gone over, well, 2. So OMB circular is where you will go to find budget information, budget formulation, budget execution, anything on the budget you can find in OMB circular A11. And as it states there, OMB budget guidance such as OMB circular A11. And last week we also talked about another OMB circular. Anybody remember that one? When we deal with contract versus in-house. Commercial activity. Say again?
A76.
A76. So anytime you see A76, you're dealing with commercial activity, whether it's the government doing the job or a contractor doing the job. That information is found in OMB circular A76. So today with internal control, when you look at the second to last and the last paragraph, you have a new OMB circular A123, which should be easy to remember, and that is tied directly with internal control. So anything, any internal control guidance from the Office of Management and Budget, we can find in OMB circular A123. So I wanted to point those out to you. The last paragraph also talks about a familiar law or act, the Federal Managers Financial Integrity Act of 1982, together with the OMB circular A123 are what mandated that we have accountability. So you can have the resources, you have the appropriations, but then we have to have accountability of those resources. So laws such as the Federal Managers Financial Integrity Act, which is a law, is what mandates those procedures be put in place for internal controls and accountability of the resources. So any question on the background? So that I think is the only thing I wanted to point out there. Yeah, because we'll talk about this other stuff later. All right, so when you go to page, so it's the bottom of page 6 up to page 7, they go into more detail with the Federal Financial Integrity Act, FM Financial Integrity Act. You can read that. And you also see the OMB circular A123. And then I'm going to skip the second to last one on page 7 and go to the last one at the bottom. And then I'll come back to the GAO one. So from the Department of Defense, you also have guidance on internal control. And that is the DODI 5010.40. Yes, I've had people come back and say they had a list of regulation governing the internal control, 5010.10, 5010.30, 5010.40, whatever the response is. Make sure you know it's 5010.40 is the DOD, the DODI regulation or guidance on internal control. So like OMB gives you circulars, Department of Defense often gives us DOD instructions, DODI. All right, now let's go back to the second paragraph on page 137. So all of these agencies provide guidance on internal control. You also have guidance from the GAO. What does GAO stand for? As it states, Government Accountability Office. Who does the GAO work for? Anybody, please answer.
That's the legislative.
The legislative branch, right? So GAO works for the legislative branch. They're independent from the executive branch. And so they monitor the executive branch, the budget that we give them, that Congress approves. And so the GAO's regulation is the GAO Standards for Internal Control or the GAO Green Book. So I'm going to take this opportunity now because you'll have 3 GAO guidances that will come up in the study guide. And think of a stoplight. On a stoplight, you have red, yellow, and green. You have a GAO red book, GAO green, yellow book, let me stay in order, and the GAO green book. So we just learned the green book, when you read that second paragraph on page 7, the green book talks about internal control. Does anybody know what the red and the yellow book talks about? Let me check some learning. Not sure what your backgrounds are. Any takers? All right, so the red in the stoplight is the GAO red book, deals with appropriations. So anything you want to know from the GAO standpoint on appropriations, you find in the GAO red book. The yellow book is auditing. GAO yellow book deals with auditing. Whatever the actual name is deals with audit. And the green book is internal control. So just think of a stoplight, appropriations, auditing, internal control. I get the appropriations from Congress, that's higher level. Then I need to be auditable. I need to ensure that people are using these properly. And internal control are those things that we do at our level to make sure that we have reasonable assurance that we are mitigating all risk. What is the difference between internal control and auditing? Would anyone like to share? What is the difference between when I say internal control versus auditing?
The way I look at it is like auditing is like an outside external entity that is trying to determine like if our organization is conducting themselves in the proper manner. And I feel the internal control is like in the name, like internal amongst ourselves to ensure that we are meeting those external auditing standards.
Okay, that's
Something like
perfect, Alan. Yes, thank you, sir. So that's perfect. So internal control is exactly as it says, internal. Those measures that you put in place. You have your own IC section, internal control section, that inspects your operation, your processes, your separation of duties. There are people on orders if they're supposed to be, or do you have the same person inputting a document and approving, certifying their own document? That's your internal control. You can look at auditing as an external organization, somebody who has nothing invested in your particular organization with fresh eyes coming in to evaluate. It's not necessarily to point out anything bad. It's to make sure that you know where the areas that you need to work on to enhance your operation. You're not going to be able to cover everything or fix everything in your organization. So you want to know those key areas. And most auditors, they'll have a checklist of questions. So hopefully everybody on the line, if you're studying for CDFM, you at least have been a part of some type of inspection where they give you a checklist and they say, okay, you got to have the policy letters, you got to have the SOP, and you got to go down this checklist of things because it kind of guides what they're going to be looking at. So you can fix those things as you move along. So RED, GAO, Government Accountability Office, is an external auditing agency. There you go, the word auditing again, that works directly for Congress to let Congress know what we're doing or not doing with the appropriation. So GAO Red Book deals with appropriation. GAO Yellow Book deals with auditing. GAO Green Book deals with internal control. And I'm repeating it here because you're not going to see this again. You're not going to see it together and nor are you going to see the internal control one again, other than this section right here on this page. So always remember there's 3 different ones. So we go into the law a little bit deeper on page 8. It's pretty straightforward, talks about the GAO standards, the law, the Financial Managers Integrity Act, what it's allowed to do. Obligations and costs are in compliance, so that's what they're making sure. So I'm not going to go in detail. The OMB Circular A123. So remember, OMB Circular A11 deals with budget. And you see what I'm doing? It's not that I'm senile, is I saw another OMB circular, so I'm recapping the ones I already know. OMB Circular A76 deals with commercial activity. OMB Circular A123 addresses OMB's information on internal control. So they have section page 9 through 10. They go over the value on page 10, 1 through 10, establishing the ERM. And I'm not going to go through each one of those, because this information is pretty straightforward. Even on page 11, the model is when you're doing an internal control or identifying your risk, you want to make sure you know, as I mentioned, if you have a large organization or even a small one, you cannot look at everything in the organization. So you have to establish what context you're going to be looking at that. So you identify the risk, you analyze the impact of that risk, you find courses of actions that will mitigate the risk, and then you pick the best course of action. But I'm going to move to page 1 through 12, risk profile. So in the OMB Circular A123, what it does, it requires the agencies to develop a risk profile. So we're going to look at what that means. So in the second paragraph, the primary purpose of that risk profile is to show the analytical process that that agency went through to identify the risk and to mitigate the risk. So what are their objectives and arising from its activities and operation? So I'm reading the second paragraph on the risk profile. Now, the last sentence of the paragraph says they throw the word from risk profile, then we jump to risk register. So I need to know the difference. The risk profile is a list of all your risks, but the risk profile differs from a risk register in that it is a prioritized inventory of the most significant risk identified and assessed through the risk assessment process versus a complete inventory of risk. So your risk register is just a complete list of all your risks. The risk profile is the most significant risk. That's how I understood that piece. Risk profile identifies the most significant risk, and the risk register just registers, as it says, all the risks in your organization. Any question on that? So the difference between risk profile identify on page 1 through 12 and risk register. All right, moving on to page 1 through 13. Now we look at the definition of internal control. So this is going into the GAO Green Book. So the Green Book defines, and here it doesn't even put the word GAO, so that's why I always say it together, GAO Green Book. It gives you the GAO's definition of internal control, and you can read through those sections. Any questions thus far? Most of this is information. All right, I'm moving on to page 1 through 17 at the bottom. More about the GAO Green Book. And it just kind of shows you how the book is broken down at the bottom of 17, the different sections, what's discussed. It defines internal control, it's reliability, compliance with the laws, it's making sure all of those are straightforward information. All right, as far as information that you need to know, we'll move to page 19 on the chart or on that page. So in the GAO Green Book, you have the GAO standards for internal control. You have 5 standards: control environment, risk assessment, control activities, information and communication, and monitoring. You need to know those, because once you move to the next pages, you'll have 17 principles that fall under each individual one, and you kind of have to know, okay, what makes that a control activity versus control environment. So the best thing is to move on to page 20. So you have to read each one of the principles under that, because I've had some people who said even on the practice test, they might give you a principle and then you have to determine, okay, which GAO standards does this principle fall under? So you read through each one. Controlling the environment. Think about the word environment. So as a manager, that manager is dedicated to improving the organization. So they put organizational structures that says that. So let's see. Oversight body of management demonstrate a commitment to integrity. So as the leaders, make sure they are controlling what they say, control the narrative was a term that we always use. So they make sure that environment, they know, okay, we can't cut corners here in this section because that manager, that supervisor, that director is dedicated to integrity. Risk assessment. So you have 4 of those principles under that one. Control activity, information, and communication. So the way you may see it again, I'm not going to say 100% because like I said, I don't see the exam, but the way you may see it again in multiple choice is you'll have the GAO standards to pick from, and again, they'll give you a different environment or principle. Like I think I had someone ask me, let me see. Like number 6, under risk assessment on page 20, management should define objectives clearly to enable the identification of risk. Well, that one has the word risk in it, so that one was too easy. Management should identify, analyze, and respond to risk. So some of this, just read the entire question that's being asked of you. Yes, Ms. Tina, go ahead.
You know, I've actually seen these questions in the CDFM mobile app where they've asked them just the way where they give the scenario, just what you read, the management should define the objective, and they will ask in the app, which one of the 5 is this associated to? I've seen the questions that way.
And you've actually seen it.
Yeah.
Right, because
yeah.
it doesn't make, there's nothing else you can do other than that. Is if you have a list of things, what they're going to do is jumble it up and see if you want to be, if you say you know the information, kind of like with everything else, if I jumble it up, can you separate the parts? So if a lot of it, if you read the entire question or entire response, you can find the answer in there. Because actually, let's see, the risk one has all the risk, the word risk in them. The last one says management should identify, analyze, and respond to significant changes that could impact the internal control system. So think about it. So the management wants to know significant changes. So that's the key word there for me, is I know anything with significant changes is going to be under risk assessment. So read through all the principles and you kind of pull out the words associated with it. All right, so those are the 5 GAO standards. Now we're going to be looking at, let's go page 23, 1 through 23, the different categories, how do you identify deficiencies and so forth. So you can read through the first paragraph, pretty straightforward. but we want to look at the categories because these aren't things that most of us are familiar with. So categories and reporting requirements for internal control deficiencies. So while doing an internal control, you either can have a control deficiency, significant deficiency, or something that's a material weakness. So what you want to know is, okay, what's the difference? What do they mean? So control deficiency, if you read through it, it says it's an internal action. Implementation or operation of a control does not allow management in the normal course of operation to achieve the objectives or address the risk. So it's a control deficiency because every control I put into place, no matter what I do, I still cannot mitigate the risk. It's an internal action. A significant deficiency is a combination of various deficiencies in internal control that is less severe than a material weakness. If you read through that paragraph, it also says it's an internal action. So it's either control, that means I have some controls in place, but I still have a deficiency, or a significant deficiency, that means I have several, I have one or a combination of different deficiencies. Significant deficiencies are also reported internally within the organization and not externally, and progress against corrective action plan. Of course, if you identify a deficiency, there should be a plan or a way ahead in how to fix or correct those deficiencies. Now, the external, which is the difference between the three, is the material weakness. So material weakness now is an agency-wide problem, an agency deficiency. So agency heads determines to be significant enough to report outside of the agency. For us, our agency is the Department of Defense. So material weakness, whether it's on whatever the operation is, no matter what measures we put in place, because of whether it's, let's say, an equipment, because of the design of the equipment, there's nothing we can do to mitigate the risk or something like that. So let me pull this out. So that's the three different categories and reporting of internal control deficiencies. Under circular A123, you have additional guidance. Talks about a material weakness in internal control over operations. And remember, in financial management, we know not only have processes, we also have financial systems that spit out data. And we have to have reliability that the data they're pushing out is correct. So at the bottom of page 23, you can have material weakness over operations, which is the first, those 4 bullets deals with operations. A material weakness in internal control over our reporting process. What are we reporting? And a material weakness over external financial reporting. So you got another list down there. Whenever you have a list of things, make sure you know the differences between them. Okay, I don't see any hands or any questions thus far. All right, who could tell me what's the DoD regulation on internal control? DoD regulation.
2-3.
Go ahead, Ms. Sheila.
A123.
OMB circular A123. No, I said the DoD level.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Go ahead. I'll give you a second chance.
Yeah, I got it. It's the DoD. Did I say that right?
Yes, ma'am. The DoD 5010.40.
Okay.
Yes, to say the whole thing, because if whatever you study, you repeat exactly the way it's supposed to be. So if you see it on a test where it says 5010.30, 5010.40, and when you're flustered, when you're nervous, if you don't know what right looks like, then you can easily get mixed up. So 5010.40, because that's really the only one I think where we actually focus in on in this study guide. All right, so page 20, let me see. The bottom of 24. So as it's mentioned, once you identify a deficiency, you have to have a plan in place. So based on the Federal Financial Managers Act of 1982, agency managers should develop a corrective action plan for all material weaknesses. So whatever you deficiencies you identify. But what I want to lead into is the last sentence on the bottom of 24 up to 25. Management should develop corrective action plans and track them internally at the appropriate level. But a summary of the corrective action plans for material weaknesses that have not been fully mitigated at the time of reporting must be included in the agency financial report and the performance and accountability report or any other management report. So those are two reports. I'm trying to see if they mentioned the reports before this instance. Those, remember, these are DOD reports. So DOD annually has to submit reports to hire. So who is the DOD's hire? Who are they reporting to?
They report to the legislative.
The Department of Defense, do they directly in the hierarchy report to the legislative? When it comes to the budget, who is DOD got to answer to first? So remember the hierarchy. Who does DOD, let me ask it this way. Who does DOD get their funding from? Or apportionment, let me use the right word.
Oh.
OMB.
OMB.
Okay.
Right?
I was thinking the executive, but I knew that wasn't complete, but yeah, okay.
Right, so I'm asking different ways so you can see OMB always works for the president, but remember, the budget is pushed out from OMB down to the agencies. So if there's any issues or reporting requirements, it's going to come from DOD to OMB. And then by the time it gets to Congress, that means OMB has or should have already heard about it or dealt with it if it's a defense-related item or request. All right, so two reports. I'm still looking to see if I've seen those report before. I see the acronyms. Hold on, material weakness. Material summary. Okay, go back to page 1323 under material weakness. So it's probably written somewhere else and we just overlooked it. But under material weakness, that second to last sentence, material weaknesses and a summary of corrective actions must be reported to OMB and Congress through the AFR and the PAR. So and then you go back to the top of page 25 and they explain what the PAR and the AFR are reporting requirements. So you see what the acronym stands for. So that's page 13. So you kind of have to tie it together. So remember, if you see an acronym, make sure you know what it stands for. All right, any question on that? All right, page 27, let's look at DOD material weakness. So material weakness are those things that if at the lowest level, they could not correct it. There are 4 levels of material weakness. It's the DOD level, components, the major command, or at the installation level. When a weakness is serious enough to merit OSD attention, it's a DOD level material weakness that cannot be resolved at the Secretary of Defense level. So it's kind of like if your hire cannot correct it, and it has to be reported to the next level. So the component level, when a weakness exists throughout a DOD component or at one or more of its major commands or activities requiring the DOD, if it has to go from the component to DOD, it's a component level problem. Major commands, same thing. When a weakness exists, they can't fix it, then it goes to the component. And installation or activity level, when a weakness requires the attention of the head of an installation. So for DoD level material weaknesses, DoD component, major command, and installation level. So what are our internal control reporting requirements? Begins on the bottom of page 1327. You got the annual assurance statement. And let me see, I think they go into more detail on page 29. So I'm going to move over to page 29, a reporting pursuant to integration. Yeah, page 29. So the annual statement of assurance. So some of you may have participated, or if you're part of the internal control or statement of assurance for your organization, you may be part of building this packet and what it looks like. So what I want you to zoom into are those bullets at the bottom of page 29. There's several statements that can go on a statement of assurance report. You have an unmodified statement of assurance, modified statement of assurance, and a statement of no assurance. Hopefully there aren't too many organizations reporting that one. All right, so let's see what unmodified. And that's why you got to be familiar with the words. So if it says unmodified, it might throw you like, okay, so maybe that's not the good one. So unmodified statement of assurance provides reasonable assurance that internal controls are effective with zero material weaknesses reported. So no weaknesses is unmodified. I didn't have to do anything special, so I didn't have to modify anything. Unmodified is the best. Modified statement of assurance means I've identified at least one or more material weaknesses that is not in conformance with federal requirements. The statement of assurance must cite the weakness and also included material weakness in internal management controls that preclude an unmodified statement. So basically identifying that material weakness that shows why you cannot have an unmodified statement of assurance. So you have one or more deficiencies, material weakness deficiencies. And a statement of no assurance says it provides that no assurance can be provided that internal controls are effective because few or no assessments were conducted. It's not enough assessments or no assessment. And the noted material weaknesses are pervasive across many key operations, or the IFMS. What does that mean? I don't know. It's substantially non-compliant. So I need to go back and find out who can tell me what IFMS means. See, every time I go over these, I see something different. There you go. On page 26, the last bullet, integrated financial management system. So I'm going to write that on that page. Integrated FM systems is IFMS. All right, so it's either our financial systems that we have to use, or there are no controls in place to correct the risk. So zero, no control. All right, so unmodified, modified, and statement of no assurance is the final. You have to do a final calling on your internal control operations. Any question on that, the reporting contents? So your contents is including everything. An operation statement of assurance provides reasonable assurance of the effectiveness of your operation. You must have, what is it, the PAR and the AFR. On the bottom of page 28, and I didn't have this highlighted before, but let me do that now. The bottom of page 28, the last paragraph before the bullets, DoD components are required to submit their annual statement of assurance to OSD by 1 October each year. And then it says, the DOD then submits its annual statement of assurance as part of its annual financial report to OMB on 15 November. So those are two requirements that you need to pull out of that. The DOD includes this assurance statement in its annual performance and accountability report, that PAR report that we talked about a couple of pages back. The general statement of assurance will include the following: the reasonable assurance that the agency's control are achieving its results, intended results, summary of your material weaknesses and non-conformances, and summary of your corrective, what you did to correct or try to correct that material weakness. All right. And then on page 31 and 32, you have all the way to 33, you have a chart with different terms and definition. So make sure you review those. Let me see if I have any that sticks out. Internal control, reasonable assurance. These are pretty straightforward.
Ms. Helen, I know at the bottom of dot 33, the third item in the risk profile is mentioned there.
Risk profile. And they didn't mention, did they mention the risk register?
No.
So the
No,
only
they did not.
time, okay, so the only time that risk register was mentioned was on that page with the risk profile. So those are the kind of things that I look for as I go through the material, is to see when a certain information was mentioned and if it's repeated again, and if not, then it probably is important. So on that chart on page 33, you may want to put the page 1.3.12 to take you back to the risk profile / versus the risk register, because the register is only mentioned there. Testing significance, material, reasonable assurance, internal control. Okay, that was a pretty easy one. Let me see. All right, so I will pause because it looked like this is the end of 1.3. And so the idea, once we're done with the sessions, is that you have an opportunity to go over the information again. Your only means of success for these exams is to repeat the information, whether you do it. Now, I do like to talk out loud, so I'm one of those, when I'm taking a test, they have to remind me I can't move my mouth. It's like, so I had to learn how to, sit there and think. So, but it's always good to say it out loud so that you can hear yourself saying it. And even if your mouth's closed, you will still be trained to repeat the words. If you see the acronym, you should automatically know, and who works for whom, because again, you have to know, okay, Congress, they got the Congressional Budget Office, they have GAO. What else Congress have? The House Senate Committee, the House and Senate, the budget committees, all of those things. So you could write your list of all the things that fall under Congress. GAO, red book, yellow book, green book, all of that, because that's all part of Congress. Then everything you know with OMB, the president, executive branch, OMB Circular A11, OMB Circular A123, OMB Circular A76. And then when you get down to DOD, the Secretary of Defense, USD Comptroller, what else we went over so far? The DOD 5010.40. So at the end of you going through all this material, you should be able to take a blank sheet and just start spitting out information. Because again, if you haven't taken any of these exams, most of the testing sites, you are not allowed to have any material in front of you. And so maybe I think module 2 might, because you might have to do some calculations so that you could take a blank sheet of paper. But especially if you're at the home testing, I know the proctor always makes you take a surround picture of the room. And like she says, you can't be moving your mouth, even though you're talking to yourself. They can't see what else is around you. So they don't want to make sure somebody's not feeding you the information. All right, so that's all I have for today for CDFM Module 1, Competency 3, Risk Management's Responsibility for Enterprise and Risk Management and Internal Control. Next week, we will go over the fiscal law. So even though last week with Manpower, we went over some of that fiscal law stuff with the ethics and the gifts and all of that. But we're going to actually go over Module 3.1 to get some additional fiscal law information to put with Module 1. As mentioned, the majority of the question comes from fiscal law and 1.1. Are there any questions, concerns, comments about anything we've covered up to this point or the way ahead? Take the glasses out, like, ooh. All right, so if you haven't already subscribed to our YouTube page, please do so. I'm going to put the link once I get home because I cannot access YouTube from the office, so I'll take care of it once I get off. This video would then be uploaded to YouTube and the link will be provided here and also on the Facebook for those that are on Facebook and the YouTube. So understand that if you want to download it once it loads here, it's fine, but it's going to have an expiration date where it's going to delete off of the Teams app. So you'll have to download it or just wait until I upload it on the YouTube and then you can access it there also. If there's nothing else, I will stand by for a couple of minutes. Thank you all for stopping by. This is Helen Thomas and the CDFM Study Group. I'll see you guys again next time.
Thank you, Miss Helen. It was great. Thank you
You're
very
welcome.
much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.